Okay, I'm going to get started. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Open University Centre for Literacy and Social Justice seminar on the decline in volitional reading and evidence-informed ways forward. We're delighted today to welcome Professor Sarah McGowan from the University of Edinburgh and Dr. Agnieszka Kuzmikova from Charles University in Prague and Professor Teresa Kremin from the Open University. And they will all be drawing on their position paper on this issue. They're part of a wider international group of reading scholars who were drawn together by Teresa Kremin back in 2020 in order to advance research in the field of volitional reading and inform policy and practice. Teresa, next slide, please. Their colleagues are Associate Professor Chin-Yi Lo from the National Institute of Education in Singapore and Professor Laura Scholes from the Australian Catholic University, who are making a parallel presentation in Singapore in April. And the group have met very regularly since 2020, supporting each other, presenting together at conferences, editing a special issue of the Journal of Language and Education on the future of volitional reading. And Teresa and Sarah have also edited a book drawing on global perspectives on reading for pleasure. At the end of the seminar, Agnieszka, Sarah and Teresa do plan to leave some time for questions. So please pop those into the chat as we go along through the session, and I will be inviting them to respond to some of the questions when we get to the end of the seminar. We may not get to everybody's questions, but I'll do my best to fit as many in as possible in the last 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer at the end of our session. So very big welcome to all of you joining us here online, and I'm going to hand over now to Teresa and colleagues to begin the seminar this afternoon.
Thank you, Helen. We look forward to illuminating our position paper. It's been widely shared with governments in our own countries, and it's in the process of being translated into several languages. This gives you a structure of the seminar. We're drawing on research evidence to illuminate the decline in volitional reading and why this matters, to challenge some persistent myths that hinder effective action, and to propose some principles and a trio of pedagogical approaches to support the habit of reading. So, turning to the decline. The international evidence from large-scale progress in international reading literacy study with our 10-year-olds, known as PEARLS, and the programme of international student assessment for 15-year-olds, PISA, indicates that volitional reading is far less popular than it used to be. The data suggests that many young people have a limited interest in reading in their own time, and that it's become, for some, somewhat of a functional task. Evidence also indicates that reading enjoyment declines with age, and also that gender and socioeconomic context are influential, with boys and those from low socioeconomic contexts being less likely to read in their own time. However, a nuanced approach to understanding the gender reading gap is necessary, as the OECD's evidence shows, because gender differences in reading enjoyment are intersectional. They're influenced by ethnicity and by socioeconomic status, as well as by gender. Reading behaviours, as well as attitudes, are also shifting among many young people, who report reading less frequently, for example. Although it is interesting to find that the 2018 PISA survey did indicate a slight increase internationally in the amount of time young people were spending reading. These were the 15-year-olds. But this didn't denote sustained periods of immersion. Rather, it suggested that children were relatively briefly using their digital devices to access information and to fulfill practical tasks. It is interesting too, though, I think, that this international data set still indicates, as it has for many years, that fiction text in print-based formats remain the most popular amongst our 15-year-olds. Additionally, in the US, a decline in adult reading has also been noted. In the Bone et al. Study, which just came out last year, the researchers analysed data from the American Time Use Survey from 2003 to 2023, and they found a relative decrease of 2% per year in daily reading for pleasure. In that study, they classified this as reading for personal interest, for example, reading a magazine, a book, a newspaper in print or online or on an e-reader, and listening to audiobooks, as well as reading to or with children. So all of that is in the decline across the last 20 years. Studies in the UK also confirm this, suggesting perhaps to all of us that it's possible we're facing an intergenerational cycle of disaffection and disinterest in volitional reading. And without reading role models in the home, in schools, and in wider society, it's likely our young people will find it harder to develop the habit of reading. Multiple other factors influence children and young people's desire to read. Intersecting societal challenges, for example, can shape and can constrain young people's opportunities to access text. For example, text access has been shown to be connected to socioeconomic status, with young people living in underserved areas having reduced access to texts, and studies show that these inequalities are entrenched across multiple locations, such as schools, shops, and libraries. In certain areas, Newman and Moland argue, young people are living in book deserts. Additionally, access to and extensive use of digital media, as we all know, continue to impact upon children and indeed adults' recreational reading, creating an appetite for instant gratification and edutainment that seriously competes for all our time and attention. Scholars such as Marianne Wolf have argued long ago that sustained surface skimming is reducing our cognitive patience as humans, our ability to tolerate ambiguity and to engage in deep reading and reflection. Other influential factors include the conceptualization of reading as a discrete set of skills that need to be taught, need to be tested individually. This surely also influences the decline. This links to what Brian Street called the autonomous model of literacy, and it's described, and as indeed is evident, within the high-profile accountability agenda that orients the teaching profession in many parts of the world to profiling the teaching of skills of reading at the relative expense of developing the young people's desire, their motivation, or the will to read. And overcrowded curricula, as we all know, create tensions and dilemmas for many schools and teachers, indeed as well as parents, who may position reading as a requirement, an obligation, an expectation even, that can have seriously negative consequences. So let's turn to why these influential factors really matter. Why volitional reading matters. Since the turn of the century, analyses of the OECD datasets have consistently demonstrated a bidirectional relationship between reading engagement and reading attainment. This reciprocal relationship has been noted in many, many countries across the world: England, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, Turkey, the US, and it's also demonstrated and documented in the Malanchini study here, which drew on longitudinal data from England and from Wales and highlights the interplay between the will to read and the skill. However, various studies indicate that this relationship is mediated in multiple ways by things such as reading frequency, age, socioeconomic context, and cultural factors, as well as text quality and genre. Other longitudinal studies, such as Sullivan and Brown's 1970s British cohort study, show that early reading for pleasure in childhood is associated with substantial cognitive progress in adolescence. And engagement in reading, as the OECD state here, by choice, is correlated with reading performance and can mediate those historic challenges of gender and socioeconomic status. Indeed, the OECD's summary shows that low-income students who are highly engaged readers, who report high reading engagement scores, attain higher reading performance scores than high-income students who are less engaged, who report low reading engagement. So, as many people have argued, and we would also support, this is a matter of social justice. Research studies also show there are a number of other academic benefits that are associated with volitional reading. For example, the fourth one there, Uhar and Rupley. That's a systematic review of experimental studies across nearly 40 years, and it highlights the impact of recreational reading on the writing performance of 10 to 16-year-olds. On the basis of their review of these multiple studies, they conclude that independent reading enhances the quality of both narrative and descriptive writing. and they highlight in particular the impact on coherence, on structure, and on vocabulary. And that, of course, links to Sullivan and Brown's study, which also showed the impact on enhanced vocabulary as well as spelling. And at least as significantly, potentially more in these contemporary times, in the last 10 years, an increasing number of studies have begun to reveal relationships between volitional reading and psychological well-being. Drawing on longitudinal data from the UK Millennium Cohort study, another large-scale study over time, Mack and Fancourt's 2020 paper there revealed that daily volitional reading outside school in children's own time, not in required time in school, but in my time at home, by 7-year-olds, is associated both with lower levels of emotional problems and better pro-social behaviour by aged 11. And Sun et al., you can see in the last line there, another large-scale national cohort study, this time in the US, of over 10,000 plus teenagers, affirms that early reading for pleasure is not only longitudinally associated with better mental health, but it also is associated with different brain structures and higher levels of cognitive performance in adolescence. So looking across these 4 slides on the key benefits, we can see that these and many other studies show that when young people choose to read regularly, they become more proficient readers, they do better academically, and they experience greater well-being and stronger cognitive outcomes. But let's take a moment to reflect on the evidence base I've shared so far. This is related to volitional book reading, and predominantly these have been large-scale quantitative studies. These are explicitly correlational in nature. They do not claim causality. We need to be clear about that. And most of them rely upon self-reported data from surveys, some in the form of parental reports for children in the early stages of reading, or the views of older readers, which are always, pretty well always, reported at a fixed point in time. Although, as I've said, the longitudinal studies do at least take us across time. These studies, though, offer valuable correlational insights. Yet seen through the lens of such surveys, reading is rather framed more as a measurable result than a socially lived experience. Surveys alone cannot capture young people's affective, social, and relational engagement as readers. But studies that focus on young people themselves and their voices allow for far more nuanced insights, and they highlight the importance of young people's reader identities, how they view themselves as readers, their beliefs, their habits and experiences of reading. Their identities are in part constructed by the activities in which they participate and in which they themselves are shaped by the adults and the peers' conceptions of reading, or perhaps they're shaped by adults or peers' misconceptions of reading. So I'm going to hand over now to Aneshka to explore some of these myths and misconceptions.
Okay, thanks very much, Teresa. So as you heard, Teresa has given us the statistics and the big data and the hard numbers out there regarding reading and its benefits. But it is also important to get a qualitative sense of young people's authentic experiences, the individual stories that are more difficult to quantify. And I work as a reading researcher, and in this line of work, I help children reflect upon and share these authentic experiences of reading, which is the loveliest job in the world. And I'm struck times and again, can you switch to the next slide, by how often children start the research session by telling me they do not read, and by how often they feel insufficient as readers. However, quite often, the young person and I eventually, after some talking, figure out that they are good enough readers with some great potential to grow, and that their initial reservations about their reading skills and competences were at least partly caused by all kinds of beliefs out there that were inherited from adults about how reading works for children and what counts as proper reading and what doesn't. And in the position paper, we identified 4 sets of such beliefs. Next slide. Which we call myths about volitional reading, and which we unpick in the position paper by invoking specifically qualitative empirical evidence that gives voice to children and young readers. And the four myths that we deal with are the following: boys don't read, young people should only or primarily read novels, reading is solitary, and reading only matters in the primary years. Now, the four myths should be thought of as interconnected rather than mutually distinct. And I'll say something about each one of them, because we have limited time, I will capitalize on this interconnected nature and deal more in depth with just two of them, namely the idea that reading is solitary and the idea that young people should only read novels. And I will start with the idea that reading is solitary because, in my view, that one is the broadest, as in covering the broadest area of lived experience that Teresa was referring to at the end of her introduction. Okay, so as for reading is solitary, I think those of us who work with children, but also generally speaking, when we think about reading, we go and visualize a reader who is this silent individual person engrossed in a book and detached from their social surroundings and social networks, both physically and mentally, right? But actually, many children have a fundamentally social view of reading and its purposes. And it is not just that they think about other people, say their peers or family, when they're selecting things to read. They also want to have people around and interact with them as they read. And this is best supported when they're allowed time to talk with each other during reading, and when the texts provided invite such talking. So as for the first point, the time to talk, for instance, Teresa and Helen and their colleagues have analyzed recordings of children's informal book talk in early years educational settings. And in their paper from 2024, they tell beautiful stories of how peer-to-peer informal book talk allowed especially the shy children in the groups to reposition their identities and project a sense of expertise. But also, this informal book talk became a social glue of sorts, because children who normally wouldn't even play together suddenly enjoyed reminiscing together on past experiences of communal read-alouds, for instance. As for the second point, that is the importance of text that invites social interaction, I'd like to mention some older work that is particularly close to my heart. A couple of decades ago, Gemma Moss observed the choices that children made in classrooms for their free choice reading. And she was focusing specifically on boys and their preference for expository nonfiction rather than fiction. And what she found ran against lots of common stereotypes of nonfiction being a way of escaping from social and socio-emotional experiences. Because the boys who chose nonfiction books also often chose to read them socially rather than individually. And this social reading was invited by the very design of these books that differed from linear fiction with shorter text snippets and lots of images and captions, and the nonlinear structure that allowed flipping back and forth together and attending jointly to specific pieces on the double page. And of course, this sociality is also there for other segmented or graphic genres, such as picture books. Finally, I have a third nugget of research regarding the idea that reading is solitary. So I would like to mention a study conducted by my collaborator Marketa Supa and I, in which we found that, in which we were sort of looking at children's story-related practices more generally, not only reading. And we found that some children in the cohort were put off by reading as they knew it from school, that is, the solitary notion of reading, because it did not allow them to have shared and simultaneous visual images and emotions with their peers in real time, right? So this being out of sync when reading, rather than being too lazy to read or whatever, was an important factor in these children's preferences for stories in video format over text format. So some children do not just want to share text, they also want to share their innermost experiences, as it were. Okay, now let's move on to the next myth to be unpicked, and that is the idea that young children should only or primarily read novels. I guess you have all heard this at some point, that nonfiction or comic books or series books or magazines do not qualify in properly fostering young readers. Which also means that often the children who are fans of these genres feel like they're doing something wrong or that they're not doing reading properly, as it were. So in addition to Gemma Moss's research that I've just mentioned, I'd like to mention work by Sally Jones.
Pardon? Research ethics meeting.
The
date in the diary. Not 6 months, David. I'd love it to be in the diary before.
I'm racing it, saying
Sorry.
Keep going, Aneshka, and hopefully Debbie will have silenced the colleague.
Okay, great. So in addition to Gemma Moss's work, I thought I'd mention work by Sally Jones, who worked with children in Singapore and found that series books, rather than standalone novels, served as the ultimate social glue and reading booster in her particular environment. So these series books benefited especially children who otherwise were marginalized on socioeconomic or cultural grounds, because they're everywhere and because they create virtual worlds for children to bond over regardless of socioeconomic status. And also, their relatively accessible language abolishes linguistic inequalities, Singapore being a multilingual society, right? And finally, I'd also like to say that in my own research experience with children living in Czechia, I can see that any type of text can deeply stimulate a child's imagination, provided that there is something about the text, say its topic, typically, but not only, that the child is personally interested and invested in. And this includes even the most technical or scientific or even ephemeral writing. So, for instance, I've met a boy in my research whom I call Vincent, who had read a full bookcase of encyclopedias on the topic of space. And importantly, he was putting his space expertise to highly imaginative use. So he was making up science fiction stories in which he cast himself in the role of a spaceship captain, for instance. He made art and constructed objects related to these fantasies, which included scientifically accurate specialist knowledge. Interestingly, though, Vincent considered himself a non-reader. Okay, so Vincent's story brings me to the next myth to be mentioned, and that is the idea that boys don't read, which is quite widespread. We've already heard some of it from Teresa, and it causes moral panics worldwide. And sometimes it is understood broadly, as in boys don't engage in any volitional reading at all. And sometimes it is understood more narrowly, as in boys don't read the stuff that really counts, such as novels. And here I'd like to offer the work of Laura Scholes, who is also our co-author on the position paper. And Laura has been studying boys reading for a long time using in-depth qualitative approaches. And in her work, she shows how harmful it is when being boy is reduced to a diagnosis with specific symptoms in terms of reading, or rather non-reading behaviors. And she also shows that there are huge differences among boys depending on their socioeconomic background and on whether they live in cities or in rural areas, etc. And as part of one study, Laura has, for instance, interviewed boys in year 4 who, once appropriately prompted by the researcher, became stunningly articulate about their reading choices and preferences, and importantly, about how these preferences had evolved for them across years. For instance, from preferring nonfiction in year 3 to preferring fiction in year 4. And finally, speaking about across years, it is, next slide, please. It is also important to at least briefly mention that in various educational systems, systematic support for young volitional readers often ends in the primary years, as though adolescents do not need any support or active interest from adults. And that also is a misconception, obviously. And for example, our co-author Chinny Low has followed a group of high-performing omnivore adolescent readers and found, among other things, that these readers differed from the rest of their peers by having been hugely supported in developing their reading taste and habits by adults into their teen years. So this much for the four myths. We could spend much more time talking about them, but I just wanted to say, when you leave this seminar, please dedicate a couple of minutes to thinking to what extent they affect you or the children in your lives, whether personal or professional. And now back over to Sarah, actually, who will talk for a bit about the principles that underpin volitional reading.
Thank you, Aneshka. So yes, I plan to focus now on research-informed ways forward by highlighting principles to support volitional reading. Now, the research literature focused on understanding and supporting children and young people's volitional reading is very complex, as you've just learned, and it can be difficult to navigate as well. As you've seen from both Teresa and Aneshka, there is research adopting different methodological approaches, for example, longitudinal, cross-sectional and experimental studies, through to interviews and observation-based research. Further, there are systematic reviews and meta-analyses, in addition to valuable theoretical and conceptual contributions. In addition, research exploring volitional reading often does so from different disciplinary perspectives, for example, psychological, sociocultural, or educational. Now, this incredibly rich research literature is very valuable, but it can be difficult to know where to start and what to focus on to support children and young people's volitional reading. And so what I plan to share next are 6 principles outlined in the position paper, which are intended to distill this complex research to guide practice. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first principle is that of provision of an access. That is, children and young people need access to books and other texts which reflect their personal interests, preferences, lives, experiences, and abilities. Indeed, it is impossible to support volitional reading unless children have access to quality texts aligned with their interests. So in terms of what this means for practice, it involves curating a book or text collection within your school which aligns with students' preferences. Part of this will involve removing outdated or unused texts to make book provision as relevant and as appealing as possible. Where budgets allow, we would also encourage and invite children and young people's input into new book and text provision and pay particular attention to those children who maybe don't have quality access to books or texts, ensuring that their reading interests and needs are met. Finally, access is also about giving children and young people regular opportunities to visit and browse books and texts from the school library. A perfectly curated collection, but with few opportunities to visit and borrow, is not going to support volitional reading. Next slide, please. The next principle mentioned in the position paper is that of agency and choice. That is, children and young people need support to develop the knowledge and strategies to independently and successfully choose books and other texts which reflect their personal interests. Indeed, while children and young people in primary and secondary school are often taught the skills, for example, to decode new words or to support their comprehension of texts, it's actually very rare for them to be explicitly taught how to choose books. And it is essential that this knowledge and skill is not left to chance. So in terms of what this means for practice, we would encourage explicit teaching of skills involved in choosing books. For example, encouraging a child or young person to reflect on the type of book or text they're in the mood for, looking at features of the book or text to guide their decision making, whether that's the title, the thickness of the book, the blurb on the back, but also reading inside the book too. We also know that they can use existing knowledge of genre, of authors, but also of themselves to support book choice, in addition to seeking advice or recommendations from others. And part of the skill involved in developing skills involved in developing choice is also knowing when a book isn't right for you. So having the confidence to swap and re-choose. To do this, we would also encourage teachers and librarians to organise books and texts in a way that facilitate choice, for example, by genre, with visible recommendations and guidance. So to summarise, we feel like developing the skills and choice empowers children and young people with the skills, the knowledge and the confidence they need to shape their own journeys as readers, readers, giving them the agency that they want and they need, which is particularly important as their personal interests evolve over time. Next slide. The third principle mentioned in the position paper is that of time and routines. That is, that children and young people need to be given quality time to read books and texts they enjoy during the school day and to be encouraged and supported to develop positive reading routines that extend beyond school. Indeed, as highlighted by Teresa earlier, there's a considerable body of research demonstrating the importance of time spent reading for positive intellectual, educational, social and emotional outcomes. While schools can and should be a site in which to nurture positive reading attitudes and practices, encouraging out-of-school reading is also essential. In terms of what this means for practice, providing regular time in school to read for enjoyment and encouraging out-of-school reading is also important. But what's really important is that children and young people have a book that they're engaged with during this time, both cognitively and emotionally, for the benefits of reading to be realised. Finally, we know that behaviour change is hard, and so it's essential that we help children and young people to find books and texts that fit within and enrich their lives and daily routines if this is really going to become embedded in their everyday lives. Next slide, please. The fourth principle is that of reflection and connection. It's the idea that children and young people need opportunities to explore personally meaningful content as they read, reflecting on text content and connecting it with their own personal lives, experiences, identities, social, cultural interests, etc., etc. So in terms of what this means for practice, we need to ensure that there's quality book provision in school which reflects your student community, while also recognising that children and young people have different personal goals or motives for reading, as highlighted by Aneshka. So, for example, we know that books offer lots of different types of reading experiences, opportunities to learn, to relax, to go on an adventure, to pursue interests. And so provision needs to reflect the diversity of motives for reading, in addition to the diversity of lives and experiences. Supporting skills in book choice can also be helpful too, in addition to reflective reading practices, to connect to book content and to deepen reading experiences. Next slide, please. So moving beyond the sort of individual active reading, we're going to focus now on the fifth principle, which is that of interaction and social. That is, children and young people need positive social reading experiences. This includes opportunities to connect with others, to recommend, discuss and share books or texts in ways which are personally enjoyable and relevant as well. And it's important to recognise that not all children and young people will have the knowledge or skills or confidence to do this. And so providing support and opportunities to develop this skill is essential, in addition to allowing and encouraging different ways to connect with others, to ensure inclusive and meaningful social practices. Finally, while children's social reading experiences may be primarily in person, online reading communities can help teens to connect with others with shared interests and also receive and share recommendations. Next slide. And the final principle outlined in the position paper is that of positive experiences and success. That is the idea that children and young people need a range of rich and diverse reading experiences that are enjoyable and supportive of positive reading identities. So first of all, it's important to recognise that children and young people need access to books and texts which align with their personal skills, but also with their reading stamina. However, beyond this, we also need to broaden our understanding of what it means to be a successful reader. For example, a successful reader is not just someone who can read. A successful reader is, for example, someone who knows how to choose books or texts aligned with their interests, who can give and receive recommendations from others, who chooses to read outside of school, or who relates text material to their personal interests or identity. A successful reader is someone who uses their imagination when they read, tries out new genres or authors, or rereads their favourite books. In other words, there are lots of different ways to be a successful reader, including beyond those mentioned here. And it's really important to recognise that there are lots of different routes and journeys that children and young people can take as readers. And so we need to empower children and young people with the skills and knowledge and confidence to shape their own journeys as readers, as their interests and as their lives evolve. Next slide. So we plan to finish this webinar today by focusing on enabling pedagogies for volitional reading, focusing broadly on individually orientated pedagogies described by myself, socially orientated pedagogies, which will be described by Teresa, and reflexively orientated pedagogies described by Agnieszka. Now, while we'll present these separately, we'd like to stress that these different orientations can and sometimes are interconnected, as well as being distinct in their own right. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a reference to the diagram within the position paper, which we'd encourage you to revisit after today's talk. Next slide, please. Okay. So while there's probably so much that I would like to say in relation to individually orientated pedagogies, I suppose I would simply like to highlight that a lot of our own research centering children and young people's personal experiences of reading, they often describe books and other text types as offering lots of different types of reading experiences. So books are described as being exciting, funny, thrilling, interesting, calming, empowering, comforting, and so much more. Children and young people talk about books as providing opportunities to pursue their personal interests, to learn more about the world, themselves, and others, as a chance to spend time with fictional friends, to go on adventures, or to escape to new worlds. And so individually orientated pedagogies are therefore about supporting the personal reading interests and motives of individual children and young people, ensuring they have access to, but also opportunities to engage with books and other texts, which are personally enjoyable, engaging, empowering, and enriching. Next slide.
Thank you. If we turn to socially oriented pedagogies, these recognise that reading identities and habits are developed in a social world, and that young people's interaction with peers, parents, head teachers, authors, teachers themselves, and librarians shape and influence their relationship with reading and how they view themselves as readers. As both Sarah and Neshka have highlighted, research indicates that when educators offer opportunities for informal book blether, that is child-led, free-flowing and non-assessed, this is not only socially motivating, but it can enable young people to dig beneath the surface of the text with their peers and to deepen their understanding and their engagement. And furthermore, informal book talk that emerges spontaneously between young people and between teachers and children themselves can help them to be agentive and to take ownership of their own reading experiences. The adults who are responsibly involved in this context play a key role in socially oriented pedagogies by valuing children's interests and views, by supporting social interactions around reading, and fostering resonant connections. These might be connections to self, to others, and to the wider world about issues that matter to those individuals or to their peer groups. Making connections with and through relaxed text talk can enable young people to feel recognised, to feel accepted as readers, and it's likely to nurture a sense of belonging, especially when, as research reveals, adults demonstrate their own personal, authentic engagement as readers and reading role models in these contexts, and seek, as Sarah described, to build connected communities of readers. Operating in different spaces, offline and on, such connected communities not only widen young people's literacy networks, but significantly they can increase their awareness of and their pleasure in the communal and the relational experience of being a reader. Let me hand over now to Agnieszka to explore the reflexively oriented pedagogies.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. So as my colleagues probably already have shown to you, the reflexively oriented approaches are not a distinct set of approaches. It's more like a different angle on what has already been said, and it highlights what it does to children's ability to reflect on themselves as readers and on reading more generally. So when thinking about inviting children to reflect in relation to reading, I think most of us have encountered reflective practices that center specific texts, right? This is probably a familiar idea in general, but there are many ways of reflecting on text, from describing their language to other approaches that may be more child-centered, as it were. And I just thought I'd mention one way that Teresa and I have tried in our work, namely asking children how texts resonate with their own experiences. Next slide, please. That is asking what does this remind you of, for instance, when encountering a story, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a story. Where is it taking you in your life history, etc. This creates instant connections, or has the power to create instant connections for children between reading as this possibly abstract activity that the adults are asking me to undertake, and life. Right? You can also invite children to reflect on their reading behaviors. And this is something that Sarah and colleagues have done. They had children interview each other in this very lovely design about what generally motivated them to read. If they read for relaxation, or to learn new things, or to improve their reading skills, etc. Now, this can give children a better sense of what reading does for them in a general sense. But you can also do this at a somewhat deeper level, inviting children to think and ponder how they experience themselves, how they feel, what is the feel of themselves, of their innermost feelings in the very instant of reading. And I'll show you in my next slide what I mean by that. So judging from my own research experience, it seems that it really helps children in reflecting on themselves as readers when they're asked to consider what other children have said about their experiences. So that would be my practical advice here. So here in this slide, I'm showing you authentic statements made by children in various research studies that I've conducted about themselves. And my colleagues and I have recorded these and turned them into flashcards that other children later sorted according to their degree of agreement. And what this activity did is it spawned these incredible in-depth reflections in the young people who participated that took them places they hadn't even anticipated they could go in reflecting on themselves. Next slide, please. And I wanted to make a point of these experiences that I've just shown, such as feeling sad for an instant, or feeling lost in the story world, or experiencing things in different parts of one's body as one reads, for instance. They do not apply to fiction reading only, even though they might sound so at first sight. They're perfectly applicable across the divide between fiction and nonfiction, from what I can tell from my current research on nonfiction. For nonfiction, though, next slide, please. What is also useful is, before even starting to talk about reading, is inviting children to reflect in depth on what they consider their subjects of interest, their topics of interest. This is because nonfiction topics and nonfiction interests are often explored through a whole spectrum of practices, where reading is just one of many. And because, as I've found, children love that exploratory journey of choosing from an array of subjects and from reflecting on what they even care about, generally speaking, out there in the world, not necessarily in relation to reading, and considering their personal connections to each one of these subjects, especially, for instance, when these subjects or topics are presented in the form of little picture cards, for instance. So think back, for instance, about Vincent, the boy I mentioned, who was very keen on space. Vincent did not only nourish this interest in space through reading, he also watched videos, talked about space, engaged in fantastic imagining, art making, stargazing, what have you. And I only know this because I met him in this study that was structured in this particular way, where we asked children what topics they cared about, then what practices they cared about in relation to these topics, and only then zooming in on reading specifically, which gave reading a much more naturalistic essence in the way we talked about it. It became applied to life, as it were. And this would be my bottom line, that fostering young, reflective, volitional readers and providing the right kind of support and book recommendations, etc., starts with asking children what is meaningful to them in everyday life, in their given stage in life, and how reading can help develop that. And now over to Teresa for some final words.
Thank you, Anishka. To move forward then, we are arguing collectively and with our colleagues in Singapore and Australia that volitional reading in childhood and adolescence has very considerable power and potential, and that education systems around the world must intentionally integrate such reading into policy and into everyday practice in schools, in classrooms and libraries. In an ecosystem which supports volitional reading, young people can flourish and can encourage each other as readers and as learners. More must arguably therefore be done to ensure equitable access in the form of reading resources and of time and support, underpinned by clear principles for volitional reading in all schools and in all other settings where reading is participated in. And researchers, school leaders and teachers must surely continue to develop, to document and to evaluate their individually, socially and reflexively oriented pedagogies so that the community can learn from the growing evidence and meaningfully improve policy, provision and practice that really supports our young people. Volitional reading matters. That's what we'd argue, and we want to make an argument for creating increased space and better balance with the skills curriculum in order to recognise its value and potential. Thank you for listening. I think we have some time for questions now.
Thank you, Teresa. I've been having a look at the chat. There's a couple of embedded questions, but if anybody's got another question that they haven't had a chance to write while they've been listening, do pop it into the chat now and we'll see if we can come on to it. There's a general question, and I'm going to throw it open to the three of you, and we can see who wants to start, because I think you probably all have something to contribute to it, which comes from Charlotte towards the end of the chat, asking how do we motivate those reluctant readers during dedicated reading time? And I think Agnieszka was just offering some thoughts there about connecting with children as individuals and their wider lives as readers as a way forward. Do you have any other suggestions, Teresa or Sarah or Agnieszka, around that motivating those who really are not keen at all in, even if you've got dedicated reading time? How do we support them? Who'd like to start?
Looks like Sarah would. Go for it.
Okay, sure. So I'll say something first, and then please come in as well. I think, I mean, having dedicated reading time in school, I think can be a good thing. But I think if children and young people consistently have a text in front of them during that time that they don't enjoy reading, all it does is reinforce the idea that reading isn't for them. And so this is why it's absolutely essential that we have budgets to make sure that there is book provision in schools so that all children, young people are able to find books and texts that align with their reading interests, their skills and stamina. For some reluctant readers or struggling readers, they may have difficulties with, and they may have language difficulties, reading difficulties as well. And very often when you look at school book provision, it doesn't reflect the needs necessarily of these groups and perhaps others as well. And that's why within access and provision, we spoke about the importance of looking at whose needs maybe aren't being met within the school library and actually taking a child-focused approach and making sure that there is that provision that supports them. So I can completely understand why some reluctant readers don't enjoy dedicated reading time because they just haven't had those positive experiences.
I'd simply add they haven't yet found what reading is good for, and their teacher or supportive educators really need to spend more time getting to know them, getting to know, as Eshka was arguing, their interests in life, and then mediating potentially a visit to the library or the book corner to try to find things that might hook them in, that they might find of interest for them individually, because we're all unique readers. And Eshka, do you want to add anything?
No, I think not. I'd rather
wait for another question, Agnieszka.
Let's look at other questions. Yeah,
that's perfect. I've got some more coming in now, so that's great. I don't know if you'd like to start with this one, Agnieszka, if you've got any opinion about this. where someone is asking, and I know that the rest of you will probably have thoughts on this too, how do you respond to arguments that secondary settings should privilege learning to read over volitional reading? Anybody have I know you haven't had a chance to say anything, Agnieszka, in this question bit. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I'd need to hear more about the arguments. I mean, to me, it's more like a phrase than a proper argument, right? I what I would argue is that even secondary students are whole persons, as it were, not just students or not just performers in an academic sense. And that in order to keep going, facing the pressure of the curriculum and everything, they need to feel that their whole person is nurtured. So that would be my approach.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. Teresa, do you have something to say to that?
I think I would simply add that clearly there needs to be a balance. We are trying to support young people in accessing the whole curriculum. And the evidence from the volitional reading research shows not just the longitudinal work, but other work that shows creating that balance can actually support young readers more effectively. Because if they, year on year, are being presented with more skill reading focus, as it were, and more catch up potentially, then clearly they need the skills to be able to access the text, but they also need the desire to want to do so. And so you can listen to a lesson on the teaching skills of reading or be part of it. But if you're not emotionally engaged in it and don't desire to develop your skills as a reader because you see no point in it, then you're not going to be open to that kind of learning. But I'm sure Sarah would have something else to add. Go for it.
Oh no, I can see lots more questions coming in, so I'm
Yeah.
happy to move on to another question if you'd rather.
I'm getting a bit overwhelmed with all these questions, so there's so many good ones to choose from. But there are some in building on that, focusing on the secondary years and that idea of how whether are there things that are different? So obviously a lot of the reading for pleasure focus has been on the primary years, and maybe Sarah, you'll have some thoughts about this. Are there things that secondary interested teachers and schools should be taking away from this research that differ from that primary focus?
I think so. We've done a number of research projects with young people looking at the kind of motivators and barriers to reading during adolescence and looking at young people's experiences of reading as well. And I think one of the things that I'd highlight that's maybe different from primary is that increased sort of agency that young people want, that they want that kind of increased autonomy and agency in a way that is somewhat different. To childhood. I think the importance of sort of authentic and relatable messaging as well. So meeting young people where they are, as Agnieszka was talking about, like their whole lives, where they are at the moment, what their future aspirations may be, and how reading may sort of sit within that as well. And I think as well, a lot of young people are spending a lot of time on their phones too. And actually they talk about how on their phones, the content's just personalized, it pops up for them. And I think actually if we want to build reading more into their lives, we need to look at their typical behaviors as well. A lot of teenagers aren't going to a library and picking a print book off the shelves, but they do have access to a phone. And if we're able to encourage them to read more online in this way, I think this can really help too. So it's really about understanding the nature of young people's lives, what their motives are, what their ways of communicating are, and speaking to them and supporting reading in a way which is actually quite different to focusing on supporting children. And I think the only other thing I'd say is when young people talk about reading, very often they say, actually, I did read and I just stopped and I don't know why I did that anymore. And they really focus on the fact that in secondary school, they're just not given the time and space anymore. No one's really like nurturing it or encouraging it in the same way as they maybe had someone doing in primary school. And so I think there should be a sort of responsibility within secondaries to be doing this. And within that, I'd absolutely advocate for secondary school librarians and libraries as well to help with this.
Thank you, Sarah. That's great.
Can I just add,
yes,
Helen, I do think that's absolutely all valid, but I would want to say too that young people are so influenced by their peer group in adolescence. And often if you can create that kind of affinity group in which subgroups and so on, the social connection around reading, there are plenty of studies, Newsper and Gilmore, in study, Sellers, Chelsea Sellers study, which shows that some young people position themselves as resistant readers in secondary because they don't want to be recognised. Indeed, Laura Scholes argue some people are clandestine, some young people are clandestine readers in secondary school because they want to read, but they don't want to be seen reading, because that's to put my identity on the street and to expose myself. But if we create classroom and school climates in which reading is welcomed and their understandings of reading and the main reading they want to take part in is also accepted, then we create a space in which the social and reading peer culture, as it were, is accepting reading, is seeing reading as something to be welcomed and shared within the peer group. So I think it's potentially a rich space for developing the social motivation to read.
Thank you. At the other end of the age range, there's a couple of questions around early years provision and how we might promote volitional reading in an early years setting, to enable children to identify as readers and have an emotional connection to text really early in their education. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on something specific that's come out from the research, or how that relates to the general the principles that you've outlined in your paper.
Mhm. I think, early years certainly isn't my area of expertise. It's mostly primary and secondary. But I think in early years, I think there's sort of that familiarity and connection when a child sees something familiar in a book or sees something they're interested in a book. It's a high quality illustration that often draws them in initially. So I think making sure that there's texts which really do have that kind of familiarity and connection, and to build positive reading experiences as well.
Yeah, lovely.
I really agree, Sarah. That kind of building books in common, books that we share and repeat, and we can almost read the words without being able to read any words. But we know the tune, the rhythm, the pattern, and we can share it with one another. Miss has read it to us frequently, and then we go back. We see it very often in the earlier study. Helen, Lucy Rodriguez, Sam Holster, and I were involved in. We saw young people returning and returning to these beloved books because they could read it again, turn the pages, join in the chat lines, as it were, the key rhyming lines. So yeah, I agree with you.
And Jessica's got something to add to
Yeah, I
that.
was just going to say that, yeah, I was thinking the exact same thing about the importance of repetition and the positive nature of repetition also into the older age. That sometimes children who keep rereading the same stuff are thought of as, I don't know, too afraid of leaving their comfort zone, etc. But from what I've seen, repeated rereadings give a sense of knowing a text well, being sort of entering a whole world of characters or what have you, or even non-fiction subjects that you keep going back to as okay, it's a safe haven in one sense, but in another sense, each reading is different, and each reading strengthens the reader and sort of opens avenues to other books as well. So I was just going to say repetition is key also, not just in the early years, but also later.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to close the questions there. I've just got a couple of end pieces of information to share with you, but thank you everybody for your comments and reflections in the chat. So here at the Centre for Literacy and Social Justice, we've recently begun a Reading for Pleasure doctoral network. So if you're a doctoral student in the area of reading for pleasure and you'd like to become part of our network, we have bi-monthly meetings, or you're supervising a doctoral student researching reading for pleasure, do just drop us a line and get in touch and we can connect with you. Then next one, please. Also, if you are involved in initial teacher training and you're a provider, a lecturer, or you're working in a skit or a university-based setting, and you'd like to be part of our Reading for Pleasure network around initial teacher training and development, do get in touch with us and find out more about the opportunities there are to come together with like-minded colleagues and to connect the research and practice. practice. And you can see all the people who are involved already. No, that's fine, Teresa. Lots of our partner organisations here on the slide who are already part of that. Coming up soon, 2 events, a newsletter live with a focus on information text, which we're excited to include Agnieszka in, sharing a little bit more of her information text focused research, as well as 2 wonderful guest authors, Isabel Thomas and Kate Winter. So do look out for where you can sign up for that information in the newsletter and on our website. There's our website link there. And if you are, there were some questions in the chat about getting whole schools on board and trying to make sure that there's the support across the school for reading for pleasure. Do come to our website looking for support for your classroom practice, but also for ways that you can develop this across the whole school. There's lots of free resources and opportunities for further information and continuing professional development, all heavily research informed, so that you're getting the benefit of lots of other people's work in this area to support you. And I think one more, the next seminar that we have to look forward to here at the Centre for Literacy and Social Justice is with the fabulous Dr. Anna Harrison, who's from the University of Roehampton in London. And she's going to be talking to us about sibling readers, which is quite an under-researched area. And she's got some really interesting new insights to share, which I think will be interesting to everybody. So thank you to our wonderful seminar presenters today. And thank you to everybody who's been listening and joining in the questions and comments. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everybody.